Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Katie Venichuk. I am a recycling and waste minimization specialist with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, joined today by Matt Flechter, recycling market development specialist with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. Say hi, Matt.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you for joining us. Today, Matt and I will be talking through a couple of the proposed legislative changes to Michigan's solid waste management law, which is Part 115 of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. These changes are still in proposed format, so please note that any of this information may change as the legislative process moves through a session. So today we'll be talking about recycling in this module. This information is quite closely related to the updated materials management planning process, which has a separate module. So just note that if at any point you'd like to learn more about the planning process updates, there is a separate module with additional information that you can refer to. During our content, we'll talk about benchmark recycling standards and what that means, materials utilization goals, recycling rate, and recycling education. Before moving too far into the content, it's important to note that to date, recycling actually has not been defined in Part 115. So one of the first additions was a definition of recycling, quite straightforward. Recycling means an action or a process such as separation, sorting, baling, or shipping applied to materials that are no longer being used and that would have otherwise been disposed as waste for the purpose of conversion into raw materials or new products. So quite straightforward. That is in section 115053 if you would like to look at the legislation and read it for yourself. Recycling and materials management planning are working together in sync, kind of similar to the way that we've worked in the past as far as planning for adequate disposal of solid waste. The changes really come down to incorporating more recycling into the planning process so that we can create a system across the state that will help move us toward a system where we can recycle as easily as we can throw things away. So each materials management plan will now encompass a couple of additional new goals, and they're basically being referred to as materials utilization goals, or MUGs. There are also some benchmark recycling standards, which are essentially statewide access and recycling education platform for moving forward, and then calculating the best estimate county recycling rate. Best estimate is an important note here, and Matt will talk more about that. And then identifying who will be responsible for recycling education. Materials utilization goals have three things under their umbrella. I'm going to go a little out of order and talk first about the last bullet here, which is the materials utilization goals that are set by a planning area. Now, a planning area specific materials utilization goal is set by what's acknowledged as potential or opportunity based on a specific area and what type of waste is most often generated. So for example, if a county has a lot of construction and demolition waste, they may set a material utilization goal to reduce the amount of C&D waste or construction and demo waste that's going to landfill. That's a planning area specific materials utilization goal. And those goals they're just that. They're a goal. You do not need to reach a 90% reduction by a specific date or consider it a failure. The main thing here is moving towards that and demonstrating progress. In that materials management planning module that I mentioned earlier, presented by Christina Miller, she talks a little bit more about how to demonstrate progress towards these materials utilization goals, which are set by a planning area. So I suggest that you take a listen to that if you're interested in more information about the materials goals set by a planning area. But Matt and I will talk more about the benchmark recycling standards and the recycling rate. The benchmark recycling standards are laid out pretty specifically in the proposed legislative language. They're listed here as well. I'm not going to read through every single one of these verbatim, but essentially what this will do is it will put us toward a core level of recycling access across the state of Michigan and a core level of recycling education. What's listed on this slide is our core level of recycling access. So by 2022, 90% of single-family dwellings in urban areas will have access to curbside recycling, and we'll talk more about what that means. 2025, there are some population specifics, 90% in areas over 5,000. So kind of a stepwise approach towards providing recycling access for residents, no matter where they live. In terms of access to curbside recycling, it's important to note what exactly that means. That is also fairly specific as it's outlined again in section 115026, which is in this bottom corner of this slide if you'd like to reference it on your own. Access essentially means that the materials are collected at least once every 14 days, so every 2 weeks. If the materials are collected as a mixed load, the load is delivered to a compliant facility and sorted out. If the materials are collected and delivered, materials are collected and delivered to a compliant materials recovery facility, so a recycling processing facility. And this is probably the most important piece, is that curbside recycling is offered by all haulers servicing the geographic area. So as a resident, I can call any hauler and be able to get recycling service. That doesn't mean it's free of charge. It just means that I am able to get it. And again, this is that 90% number that we talked about on the last slide. If we're talking about drop-off recycling access, which was some of those 2025 goals that were highlighted on the last slide, then the drop-off must be available at least 24 hours per month for residents to come and adequately dispose of their recycling materials. There are a couple of ways for a planning area to move towards these benchmark standards. This is just a few examples, and it's not all inclusive. There are a number of ways that this could be achieved. An example would be a voluntary action by recycling service providers to offer recycling services to customers, staying within that subscription-based service model. It's possible that a municipality may find that providing the curbside services themselves is what will work best for their community. There's also examples of franchise or contract agreements with the private sector working best. And there's also the opportunity or option to pursue an ordinance specifying that haulers provide recycling services. Again, none of these is required. It is something that a planning area will evaluate and consider, and then select the best option for what works for their community in partnership with the private sector and with citizens and their needs.
That's good.
So I'll wrap up there. Quite brief overview, but we are always available for questions via call. And I will turn it over to Matt and first ask him if there's anything he would like to add based on the content that I have shared.
No, I think that was great. I think we're going to flow right into the next section here. Let me get closer to the mic as we move around, do a little shuffling here. So I want to talk about recycling grants. And before I do that, I want to send my sincere appreciation to all the work that's been done on creating this draft. There are many, many hours of work and compromise that have gone into creating this draft that will be reintroduced this year, sometime soon, hopefully by the time you're listening to this. And we have had some really great steps taken in the last legislative session to identify funding to implement these Part 115 amendments and support recycling grants. So as you know, there was funding identified, but the details for that funding were not very well spelled out in the legislation that passed last legislative session. Part 115 will work to add some clarity and direction for all of you looking to access some of those recycling grant funds. So there are three separate grant areas that we're focusing on. The first one is recycling markets program. The second would be a local recycling innovation program, and the third is a recycling access and voluntary participation program. The most important thing to note about these three grant programs are the first two are not tied in any way to having a materials management plan or making progress toward achieving the goals identified in the plan. So the recycling markets program is intended to provide grants or loans for purchasing of equipment, research and development, or associated activities to provide for new or increased use of recycled materials or to support the development of recycled markets. Local units of government and nonprofit and for-profit entities will be eligible for those funds. The second grant, the Local Recycling Innovation Grant, will provide grants or loans for developing local recycling infrastructure, for recycling education campaigns, for residents and businesses, for other activities that result in increasing recycling access and participation, for reducing waste, and for sustainable materials management. And local units of government and nonprofit and for-profit entities will be eligible for that. The last grant on the list here is the Recycling Access and Voluntary Participation Program. And this program will provide grants or loans to assist local units of government in implementing best materials utilization practices and identifying ways to innovate and collaborate with other local units and the private sector. To be eligible for a grant under this grant, a local unit must be in a county that meets the following requirements. It both has a materials management plan and has documented progress toward meeting or has met its materials utilization goals and benchmark recycling standards. So moving on to recycling rate. The materials management plan is required to identify their recycling rate. And that is under section, I can't remember right now, 11578 sub L. There it is, came to me. That in the materials management plan, every county is required to calculate a recycling rate. And this is more to identify where a county or a planning area stands at that moment so that they can better set goals and achieve progress toward increasing recycling. The proposed section defines a recycling rate as the amount of municipal solid waste recycled and composted divided by the total amount of municipal solid waste recycled, composted, landfilled, and incinerated. This has been a standard way to calculate recycling rate for quite a number of years. And it includes material such as paper, metal, glass, plastic, collected curbside. It includes the deposit containers that are collected within the planning area. And one of the most important things to note about this is that the waste that is calculated is only municipal solid waste, so it's not industrial materials. So material that is reused or avoided or converted to energy is not included in the recycling rate. And it should be noted that 11507 sub 2 states that it's the goal of the state to achieve a 45% municipal solid waste recycling rate, and as an interim step, a 30% municipal solid waste recycling rate by 2025 through the benchmark recycling standards. So what we will be looking to is the planning areas to identify what their recycling rates are, and that will help us to identify how closely we are to achieving those goals. So the data required to calculating recycling rate includes that municipal solid waste landfilled, the amount incinerated, the material composted, and the material recycled. So it's, again, the calculation is the total tons of MSW recycled and composted divided by the total tons of municipal solid waste recycled, compost, landfilled, and incinerated times 100 equals the recycling rate. So we recognize that some of this data is incomplete, and this is a iterative process that will change over time as we get better data. And it will be challenging for the first few years of the planning process as we work to gather better data. It will require some level of estimation because it's likely that the beginning years the data will be incomplete. And it's understood that data collection and evaluation is a process that, to be successful, will require continual improvement and transparency, clear communication between the private and public sector. And we are full partners in supporting your efforts and gathering that data. Calculating a recycling rate is not intended to be a tool to penalize, but rather is required so that planning areas can better identify areas of focus that may need additional support and encouragement. And we've created a guidance document that goes into quite a bit more detail on this, specifically on how sources of that data that I mentioned, like where to go about getting your solid waste disposal numbers and the incineration data, how to communicate with the facilities that have that data available. And that guidance document you will find at that link. And the recycling education outreach program, the draft legislation also calls for the plans to identify the process to increase recycling education outreach so that we have an informed citizenry on how and where to recycle. And it goes through some details in section 115.78 sub R that clarify those roles and responsibilities. So the plan is required to identify the responsible parties for education outreach. And that could be any number of people. That could be the private sector. It could be the public sector. It could be the county education, the specialists in the county they're responsible for that. It could be the planning area itself. It could be the communities. And it should specify the budget and means of funding education outreach. And if the private sector is responsible, an agreement, an ordinance, or other enforceable mechanism should be established. And she could describe the county or regional role in recycling education, including at a minimum a website, a telephone number, and a sample recycling guide for residents and businesses. So what we want with this is the plan to identify the best way forward to support recycling education. And we at DEQ know that recycling education is one of the first to be cut when budgets are tight. And that's why the funding that I mentioned earlier through the grants, we're here to support that, develop tools and resources for outreach. And we are, again, full partners in supporting those education efforts at the local level. So, Katie, you wanted me to add something?
Just the fact that there's also a one-page document providing an overview of the benchmark recycling standards as well.
Oh, awesome. Yes. So that can be found on the SWRA webpage that will be linked with this information. Mm-hmm. So if you have any questions about this, please contact Liz Brown. Her contact information is there. She will get those questions to the appropriate staff person. We will be compiling that information. We'll be identifying the questions, and we will be setting up additional outreach opportunities to communicate with you. And we appreciate your time listening to this today. Thank you.